Are you ready, kids? This isn't the video I wanted to bring you today. That video was destroyed. You'll find out next week. It's going to take me another week to fix that video and then bring it to you. This is going to be a painting challenge. 1 kitchen sponge. Is this enough to paint a whole board of scenery? So subscribe for my resilience in the face of adversity and click on my like because it turns me on. Here are the rules. 1 kitchen sponge, no other brushes, nothing else. This is the only tool I can use to paint this terrain. Is this going to be enough? Let's find out. This is the terrain set I have built for this. It is meant for Star Wars Shatterpoint, but it's very usable for Warhammer 40k. The scale is 40mm, so it doesn't look wrong in the hands of Space Marines or Orcs or something of that size. It looks like they belong in this kind of scale scenery because they are a bit bigger than the average human in the 38mm, is it now? Who knows, Warhammer's getting too big. I primed them in this red cheap primer from Halfords to give them this kind of red rusty look. The idea for this scenery is to do dusty red desert. I think that is going to suit the sponge method more than anything else is going to. I prepared my tools for painting and set to work on these nice red rusty primed scenery pieces. The first step was going to be to give them a bit of texture and darkness in the recesses. For this, I was going to use some shade. Reikland Flesh shade, to be specific. This is an orangey brown. I didn't want it to be too different to the actual rust coloured red primer. I just want it to provide a little bit of darkness and texture to the large panels. This sponge has got to go a long way, so I used just this corner for this bit. I've got to make the sponge last the whole project. This is the test piece. I'm going to go with the top corner on this piece and see how it does. My first issue was getting the sponge in the pot. That wasn't going to work, so I decided to pour it into another little container. And I actually ended up going through this whole pot of Reikland Flesh shade on this project. 1 whole pot. Now that I could access my paint better, I decided that it was time to apply it, trying to get in the recesses. But this was a little bit difficult. As you can see, I had to kind of stipple with the sponge, obviously, but it wasn't going in the cracks there. So I had to proper soak the sponge and then force it in the crevices. This did put maybe a little bit much on here, but these miniatures are going to be covered in all kinds of weathering effects too because of the texture that the sponge is going to lay down with the paint. The rest of the terrain, including this one, got a lovely coat all over, splish splash splosh, made a big old mess. It looks iffy. First step looks bad. Let's see if we can bring it back with the next step. Now it's time to actually paint something. The next step of actual painting will be Steel Legion Drab. This is going to go on all of the walls. I want it to make it look like that whitey, bony coloured desert buildings. You know, the kind of stereotype, think of a stereotype desert building, especially Star Wars, that colour. Maybe not as white, because I want it to be grimdark enough to use for 40k too. So Steel Legion Drab was a good base to build up from. I picked which sections I wanted to be this kind of wall colour and got to work. I tried not to hit any places that I wanted to be metal in the future, but it was a little bit hard because working with a sponge is not accurate. Doing this style of painting, you kind of have to be a gardener rather than an architect of your miniatures, meaning it will kind of go how it wants and you just kind of have to try and shape what you're doing with that. This is kind of painting a bit randomly. You can see I've got it all over the frame of the window there. I'll go over that later with more sponging. It's just very important to use small bits to get in the cracks because I don't want to flood the recesses with this paint. And when you're done, you end up with something like this. Zandri dust will be the next layer in this method. Select a new bit of sponge and work in smaller areas inside of the Steel Legion Drab layer we've just built up. Making sure you're being more feathered towards the edges, not building up too much solid colour, so this kind of looks like a gradient really. This is what we're going for with this technique. And once you're done with that, it will look like this. Starting to get somewhere. It's a bit bold, bit bright. Stick with me, I will darken this all down. As you can see on the rest of the scenery, it looks good. I tried to stay in the middle of those areas and where there were no kind of middles, and where these wall sections met the edges, I made sure the edges were bright as well to make sure they stood out and defined the pieces a bit more. From there we will be going up to Ushabti Bone. This is the brightest I'm going to go with this. I poured too much on a palette, then selected my next piece of Pour La Sponge and splattered it all along the corners. You can see this, like I said, defining the area, bringing it out from that recess underneath it, and the middles of sections. It all starts to come together a bit more now we've got this highlight on. It's kind of like an edge highlight sponging effect, but also nicely defined middle areas where the paint wouldn't have faded as much on these buildings. Looking okay. I think when we get to the rest of the painting, like the metallics, this is where the orange primer isn't going to look as drastic as it does now. And hopefully it will look like desert debris and dust in the cracks, built up dirt over time. Talking of metallics time, it is metallics time. Pro Acryl Dark Silver will be the base for this. I'll be putting this on a lot thicker than I did the last layer of paint on the walls. I don't want as much orange primer to show through this, just bits in the gaps where dirt would have built up over time. And because the other walls were probably made of mud or brick from this planet, which would be made from the earth from this planet, which is red. Whereas this is just going to be, and I wanted it to look like the paint had peeled back off those. This, however, is going to be metal with built up dirt in the cracks. That's what I'm aiming for. I had to be relatively careful doing these thin bits along the walls. I was just dabbing. Luckily I'd worked from bottom up, meaning the deepest sections first. It would have been a lot harder if I'd painted these metal first and tried not to hit them while doing the wall colours. I was glad that I did it this way around. This was a smart move on my part. You can see when I put these in, it's starting to pop out a lot more. It's starting to not look like it's all orange. It's starting to look like dirt and desert dust in the cracks. I have faith in this effect. This may just work. Highlighting this with Pro Acryl's Silver now, I will just be aiming at kind of the edges of things where light would glint off the edges, and also bits that I think would wear more. So you'll see a good example of that in a minute. For now, look how low this sponge is getting. Not a lot left of La Sponge. As I said, edges. This is the main focus. Just bringing these metallics out from the rest of the train piece. And also aiming at areas like the edge of this hatch where I think people would be opening and shutting it. That would wear the dirt off there, so that bit stays shiny. And around this computer terminal where people would be standing to use it. Next was just putting in the black cabling, just going along the tops like I did with the metal struts along this building, leaving the dark recesses orangey, rusty primer again. This looks like it's built up so much desert dirt over the time it's been out, maybe abandoned in the wilderness, and filling in the little computer screens as well with a bit of black, just so that looks a little bit better. I will not be doing the keys and all these different bits. This is probably the smallest detailing I will be doing on this building. So terrain is meant to fit into your board. It's not meant to be the standout thing, unless it's kind of an objective marker, maybe. But in my opinion, terrain shouldn't be the brightest thing on the board. Your miniatures should be what stands out in amongst everything there. So I want this to be nice and drab and dirty, as it kind of is already. Now it's time for the good old streaking grime. I'm doing this a little bit different to how I normally do it. I'm going to be putting the end of this pot in this bowl here, and then I'll mix it with a lot of thinner, because I'm not going to remove this from the miniature. I'm just going to be putting this on as one coat, just to settle in the cracks, make the very deep recesses a little bit darker, and just kind of bring the whole model down and dirty it a little bit more. La Sponge is looking very thin. Let's see if I can prise a bit off his carcass before he dies. There we go, that'll do. A nice big bit to slot this stuff around. This was quite satisfying to apply. I tried not to let it pull too much, but it worked. It did what I wanted it to and made the dirty primer in the gaps look like recessed shading a little bit more and brought down the rest of the bright metals, because I don't want these to be shiny. If these have been left in the desert for years, they're going to be dirty, just like your mum. With this stuff slapped all over, I left it overnight. The next day I came back with some dark red pigment powder. I needed to apply this. I normally use a makeup brush, nice and soft, but I cut a bit of sponge off with these scissors and then cut into it to make my own kind of brush in a vain attempt to try and get it to hold more pigment, because just smearing it on with a bit of sponge wasn't going to work. But I'm not going to cheat. And I cut it to the right size to fit perfectly in the pot. And do you know what? It kind of worked. I don't think it worked as well as my big soft makeup brush that I normally use, but it picked up enough pigment and worked well enough like a brush to dust it back off again. This is another success. I am only doing this up the bottom bits of the model to make it look like dust has blown at the bottom and collected, and on bits where I think there would be high kind of collection on the top, maybe around the computer terminals. This has been an amazing project. I cannot believe that I pulled this off in one evening. You'll see what happened to my cursed video next week if you tune in and subscribe, because that felt awful. I had worked all week on that video and I've had to make this in one evening. I've painted all this in one evening using the sponge and I'm very impressed. It suits 40k models perfectly. They don't look wrong on this terrain, even though it is meant to be for Star Wars, and it offers a lot of height that we're not often getting with 40k terrain. I think this would be really good for kill teams. I know I've got a Screamer Killer on the board here, but a kill team would do really nicely on this Star Wars Shatterpoint terrain, so it's worth looking into if you want to do this for your board rather than, you know, the kind of in-ship version we've got at the moment with 40k terrain. I am happy with this. This is going to permanently stay in my collection. I'm going to use this for all kinds of games. And of course, we cannot forget the sacrifices made for this video. We will miss you, L'Esponge. You will always have a place in our hearts. Goodbye, old friend. So thank you to my Patreons whose names you saw over that reveal. If you would like to join them, the link is up here now and down in the description. And I really appreciate the support that these people have given me. It's nice to see people wanting me to succeed, I guess, for once in my life. Anyway, crises aside, thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe so you can see that video that was ruined, that was meant to be for this week, and I spent one evening doing a week's worth of work to bring you this. Leave in the comments if you thought this was good. Would you be happy playing with this terrain? And I will see you next time. Remember, it's not a pile of shame, it's a pile of future fun.